Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center Livable Communities webinar series. Today's webinar is entitled Selection of Pedestrian Treatments at Unsignalized Crossings with Charlie Zagier, Director of the PBIC. My name is Jeremy Pinkham, and I am the Communication Coordinator for PBIC and the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Attendees, if you can hear me, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand so we can be sure our audience can hear us. Okay, we're getting some positive responses. That's a good sign. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. Let us take a look at this slide that shows the webinar interface. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the arrow button. Though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box here. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here, and I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program when we have built in about 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Also, so that you are not alarmed when you exit the webinar, I want to let you know that a very brief survey will open up after you leave. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Before we get started with today's program, I want to give everyone a little information about what this webinar is about. The goal of the Livable Communities webinar series is to better enable our audience to improve the quality of life in their communities by promoting safe walking and bicycling as a viable means of transportation and physical activity. The bi-monthly series was developed by the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, the national clearinghouse of pedestrian and bicycle-related safety information and resources. PBIC and today's webinar are both made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Highway Administration. The next Livable Communities webinar will be held on Thursday, March 18th from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be presented by Dr. Jillian Hutz and David Parisi, who will speak on community approaches to pedestrian safety education. The registration link is now live and can be found at walkinginfo.org/webinars. There, you will also be able to access an archived recording and transcript of today's program after the live webinar. It usually takes about a week to get everything posted. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at walkinginfo.org/training. If we are not able to get to your question at the end of the presentation, please do not hesitate to contact us. All of our web resources can be accessed at pedbikeinfo.org, and you may reach me at any time at webinars@hsrc.unc.edu or by calling 919-843-4859. In a second, I'm going to turn this over to Charlie Zagier for the feature presentation on the selection of pedestrian treatments at unsignalized crossings. While he's getting set up with this slide presentation, I want to take a quick poll from the audience. Please let us know how many participants are viewing the webinar at your site. And while you're completing this poll, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker. Charlie Zagier is Director of the PBIC and is Associate Director of Engineering and Planning at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. He has taught courses on pedestrian and roadway safety throughout the U.S. over the past 25 years. He has been Principal Investigator and Primary Report Author on numerous federal studies and guides, including the FHWA Guide, How to Develop a Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, and the NCHRP Report, a guide for reducing collisions involving pedestrians, both of which can be found in the PBIC online library. I'd like to welcome and thank Charlie for his presentation today. I'm going to close this poll now, and Thank you, everyone, for submitting your answers. And Charlie, please take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. I'd like to thank Jeremy and Katie Jones of the PBSE for all the work they put into organizing these webinars, and to Gabe Rousseau with Federal Highway Administration for allowing us to have these webinars as part of the Pedestrian Bike Information Center activities. What I'm going to be talking about today really covers a topic of pedestrian safety that is fairly confusing to a lot of agencies. Oftentimes, it's unclear how to solve a problem at an unsignalized or what we call an uncontrolled crossing location. So while we don't have all the answers, we are going to look at some of the information that we're aware of from the research, from the current guidelines, and also from the latest version of the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices that was just approved in late December. Okay, so let's see if this is going to advance. We're going to cover this in two parts. The first part is going to be on general principles of pedestrian crossing, and then we're going to talk about some of the countermeasures to address some of the crash issues. Okay, I'm getting a strange pop-up. But the first question is, why do people cross the street? And there are many different reasons on all kinds of locations, all types and ages of pedestrians. And so as engineers, planners of the roadway environment, we really need to be able to take a close look at some of the problems and issues that are going on, particularly that cause pedestrian crashes. We know that pedestrians shouldn't have to run across the street, as you can see these two teenagers here. You can see with their backs to traffic, it really puts them at a high-risk situation. And some people say, well, ideally we'd like to have traffic signals at all of our crossing locations. And while that may seem to be a good solution, it's not always practical, nor does it necessarily guarantee safety for pedestrians. And in particular, we know that many of our pedestrian crash problems are at signalized intersections or signalized mid-block places. So there are many other answers that may be appropriate for dealing with pedestrian crossings besides just putting in traffic signals. And we know that even if we could put in signals, that it would really not solve the problem, and in fact it would create other huge problems. We know that many intersections that are signalized have more crashes than before they were signalized. The people that are crossing mid-block are not criminals. They're just trying to find ways to deal with the roadway situation where they are. We know that behavior of pedestrian varies, so that when we really go try to come up with solutions, we need to be aware of the different behaviors, try to figure out why they're happening, and then take action to reduce the risk for the crossings. All right, let's look at a few principles for pedestrian crossings. Let's make the assumption that pedestrians want and need to be able to cross the street safely. We know that drivers need to understand pedestrians' intention, and pedestrians need to understand what drivers are doing. I was told about an accident or a crash in the state of Maine a few years ago when a young boy was struck by a gentleman in a pickup truck. And fortunately, the child was not hurt seriously, but the officer interviewed him in the hospital, and he asked the boy why he crossed the street in front of the truck. Didn't he see the driver? The boy said, yes, I looked, saw the driver, saw that he saw me, so I assumed he was going to stop for me. And so the police officer asked the driver, well, didn't you see the boy? And the driver said, yes, I saw the boy and saw that he saw me, so I assumed he was going to wait for me. So oftentimes, it's not even a matter of seeing the pedestrian, it's a matter of understanding the intent of the other road user and how to cross safely, or how, as a driver, you're supposed to behave, to reduce pedestrian crashes. Another principle is that we want to try to keep our crossings short. Roadway crossings that are 4, 5, 6 lanes often result in excessive exposure time for the pedestrians in the street. It increases the risk of a pedestrian-motorist conflict or collision. It increases delay to the motorist and certainly to the pedestrian. And many pedestrians, especially older or younger pedestrians, have difficulty even getting across. The other issue on speed is speed, which relates to several different consequences. Number one, higher speed reduces the driver's field of vision. Secondly, it reduces the ability of the driver to react and avoid a crash. And third, higher speeds result in higher likelihood of death. So you can see here in this slide a motorist that's going down a roadway at a fairly low rate of speed. This is 15 miles an hour. Has a fairly broad field of vision. So they can see people, bicyclists, pedestrians on both sides fairly easily. As the speed increases here to 20, you can see the field of vision starts to decrease. And at 25, decreases further. At 30, now the driver is really looking more on the horizon, so you get the picture. What you see here is the relationship in this next slide of the effects of increased speed on driver reaction and braking distance. So you can see at 10 miles an hour, a driver is able to react and stop in about 50 feet. And as you increase in speed, for example, up to 40 miles an hour, if you add in the distance that it takes, time and distance for a driver to perceive the pedestrian and put the foot on the brake and come to a complete stop, it can be 350 feet or more. So obviously, as you know, the distance for stopping for a pedestrian greatly increases as speeds are higher. And also in this next slide, you can see the relationship between the probability of death and vehicle speed. This shows, for example, that if a motorist is going 20 miles an hour and strikes a pedestrian, there's about a 15% chance that the pedestrian will die. If that speed is increased to 30 miles an hour, the probability goes up to about half, or 45%. If the driver goes still 10 miles faster at 40 miles an hour and strikes a pedestrian, the chance of death is more like 85%. So speed kills, and we can certainly reduce a lot of pedestrian crashes and the severity of those crashes if we can do something to the roadway environment or educate the driver to slow down. Okay, we also know that there are some traffic calming measures that we can talk about along a corridor, along a route, a collector street, for example, such as curb extensions, or anything you can do to sort of narrow the effective width of the street to slow down vehicle speeds, which can also reduce the chance of collision, obviously, at the crossings themselves. Okay, the other principle, and we put this in because it's sort of a fact of most people, that they are most likely to just cross where it's most convenient for them, that we find that very few pedestrians are willing to...
Just one second. It looks like we're having some technical difficulties. I think we're going to need to reload the PowerPoint in just one second, okay? Please bear with us here for a minute.
Yeah, while Jeremy's doing that, if you all would go ahead and type in any questions that you are hoping to have answered as part of this webinar. And then as we proceed, Jeremy will be looking at the questions and he'll be writing these down, and then we'll have them ready when the main presentation is over.
And I will just, if you just want to begin again, Charlie, and I'll find the slide where we were at.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Okay, one of the things, as you're getting the slides up, one of the key points that I wanted to bring up for the webinar today, and we are going to go over a lot of different strategies, but that it's so important that we really try to look at every crossing individually and also as a system, so that we're trying to diagnose specific safety problems, crash problems, but also looking at all of our pedestrian crossings throughout our city or town or county to make sure that we have sort of an overall plan on how we identify potential problems as well as sites that have had pedestrian crashes and try to deal with them in a logical, systematic manner. Okay, so can they see the slides? Okay. just can't see them on my screen. Okay. All right. Well, again, hope everybody can see the slides now. Basically, there are traffic calming measures, as we were saying, that can slow down vehicles along a corridor and therefore reduce the safety at the crossings themselves. Okay. Principle 5 is that pedestrians will cross where it's most convenient for them and not to expect them to go far out of their way. And that if they are crossing at a given location, like at a mid-block spot, that we want to see why they're crossing there and then see if we can make the crossing reasonably safe, or if it's close enough to a signal, then it might be appropriate to direct them to a nearby signalized crossing. Okay. The question about mid-block versus intersection, and I know that you've probably heard people say, oh, always go across at the intersection, it's safer. Well, some of the research we've done says that's not necessarily the case, that it really is more a function of the number of lanes, the vehicle speed, and the vehicle volume in terms of, where it's relatively safe to cross the street, that we can have pedestrians crossing mid-block that, it has the advantage of pedestrians not having to yield or worry about turning vehicles. So it really is more a function of other factors instead of whether it's mid-block or intersection. Okay, let's get into some of the countermeasures and talk about some of the pros and cons of each and where they may be best suited to be implemented on your roadway system. We are going to go through and talk about things like crosswalks, illumination at the crossing, different kinds of signs, marking, crosswalk markings, for example, raised medians and pedestrian islands, traffic signals with different pedestrian options if warranted, and overpasses, underpasses. Okay, here's a cartoon taken from the newspaper that says Biggerville's new pedestrian monkey bars not only reduce accidents but also whip people into great shape. Now, so this kind of shows that this is sort of a lighthearted attempt to indicate how we can get pedestrians safely across the street. And I think a lot of citizens out there realize that it's not always an easy thing or a safe thing to try to just do a basic street crossing. But this is not something we recommend. We're going to be getting into some other countermeasures that, however, for example, one of the other questions that comes up often is marked crosswalks. Why are they marked? When should you mark them? How does marking a crosswalk affect the risk for pedestrians? Does it create this false sense of security that some people talk about? And so the question here that asks, why are crosswalks provided? There are two main reasons. Number one, to indicate to pedestrians where they should cross, maybe a preferred crossing location, not necessarily safer, but a preferred location. Number two, to indicate to drivers where they might expect pedestrians. So it's just sort of a notice to drivers. And in terms of how do you determine where to mark a crosswalk, there's a lot of research and debate that's gone on this question for many decades. And what I'm going to read you now is basically taken right from the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So, I don't know, can I be able to see the whole screen? I can't read all that. Okay, basically the most recent version of the MUTCD just came out actually the middle of January, a few days ago, but it was finished in late 2009. And it basically said crosswalk markings provide guidance for pedestrians who are crossing roadways by defining and delineating paths on approaches to and within signalized intersections and on approaches to other intersections where traffic stops. Okay, now gets into the unsignalized part. It says in conjunction with signs and other measures, crosswalk markings help to alert road users of a designated pedestrian crossing point along the roadway at locations that are not controlled by traffic control signals or stop or yield signs. Crosswalk lines should not be used indiscriminately. Okay, so that's some of the basic language. I just copied that out of the new MUTCD. It's on the Federal Highway Administration website. But the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and I tagged that at the bottom, and it says an engineering study should be performed before a marked crosswalk is installed at a location away from a traffic signal or an approach controlled by a stop or yield sign. So this is saying that we shouldn't just go out and put marked crosswalks everywhere, particularly where there's not a signal or a stop sign. We need to do a study to make sure it's the right thing to do. Okay. Now, So the next question is, how do you determine where to mark a crosswalk? And certainly there are several ways to do that. One of the most obvious things here, and I hope you can see the arrows, but it says, in this case, apartments are close to the bus stop and stores, across from the bus stops and stores. So you know people are going to come out of their apartments and need to cross the street to take the bus or to buy their groceries, and so it's an obvious place to connect origins and destinations. So you can see here they do have a marked crosswalk across a 5-lane road with a raised median island, and the pedestrian is crossing there. They have overhead pedestrian crossing sign. So the question is, you know, can we look at these places where pedestrians need to cross the street and try to accommodate them? Now, we know many locations are not suitable for just putting in a marked crosswalk by itself. This is an example. You have looks like about a 5-lane road. Looks to be very high speed, high volume. There's no real clear location where pedestrians are going to want to cross. They may want to cross anywhere along here at the McDonald's or the Wendy's you can see on the left, or some of the other businesses along this route. So there's not a defined crossing point that would make sense to put a marked crosswalk. Here's another location that would not be good for a marked crosswalk. It shows a horizontal curve, very sharp horizontal curve, with poor sight distance. And actually, some agency has put in a crosswalk that is probably not a very good place to do that, because motorists are not going to be necessarily expecting pedestrians as they approach from either direction. There are, however, many locations that would make sense. Just common sense would say it's probably a good place for a marked crosswalk. Here's the location in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a 2-lane road. Looks to be a fairly low-speed street that connects sort of a major entrance to some kind of building to another driveway entrance. And it's right at the back of 2 bus stop locations. So you can see that people that would be wanting to take the bus might be wanting to cross here, and the crossing is appropriately located behind the bus. So the people would get off the bus, walk to the back of the bus, and then cross in the marked crosswalk. So that's a very suitable, logical place to put a marked crosswalk. Here's another one. This is a crossing near the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And they have, again, it's a fairly low-speed, narrow 2-lane road. It's a very wide marked crosswalk. You can see there are tons of pedestrians crossing in both directions, maybe going to the museums. And so this would be an appropriate place to put a marked crosswalk. You don't need a traffic signal. It doesn't warrant a traffic signal. Okay, the next slide asks, do marked crosswalks increase safety or encourage people to cross without looking? Which is a lot of the basis for some debate over the years. A few years ago, we did a study, and actually we finished in 2002. It was called the safety effects of marked versus unmarked crosswalks at uncontrolled locations. And for this study, the idea was to try to look at what are the crash risks associated with unsignalized crossings that have marked crosswalks versus those that don't. So we looked at about 2,000 crossing locations, 1,000 marked, and each of those had a nearby unmarked control site. So we wanted to do the comparison. We collected traffic volume, pedestrian volume, a number of lanes, speed limit, other characteristics of the crossings, and then tried to develop a model that would help us understand what are the factors associated with pedestrian crash risk, including whether it's marked or not. The bottom line, without going into the details of the study, is we found that for roads less than 3 lanes, mostly 2-lane roads, there was no significant difference in pedestrian crash rates, whether it was marked or unmarked, when you control for all the other exposure and other factors. However, when you're on a roadway with 3 or more lanes, there's no difference in the crash risks for marked and unmarked as long as your traffic volume is less than about 12,000 vehicles a day. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, for the multi-lane roads that have more than 12,000 vehicles a day and no median, pedestrian crash risks increase for marked crosswalks. And similarly, if the roadway is multi-lane with a raised median and greater than 15,000 vehicles a day, pedestrian crash rate increases. Okay, some of the other things we found in the study are that we found that on multi-lane roads excuse me, that having a raised median reduces pedestrian crashes about 40%. A fairly major finding. We also found that for older pedestrians, over 65, they are overrepresented in crashes on all types of roadways. So this is something to keep in mind as we go think about selecting countermeasures. We also found as part of a related study that pedestrians were not less vigilant in these marked crosswalks. They weren't, doing crazy things because the crosswalk was marked. We found that there are some other factors associated with the increased crash risk in marked crosswalks. We're going to talk about some of those. Okay. First of all, the study found that there was increased pedestrian crashes where you had a greater number of lanes and a greater traffic volume. Okay, that's kind of something we would have suspected. And other studies have found the same result. But here's one of the key factors that we found that was associated with higher pedestrian crash rates in marked crosswalks. It's what we call the multiple threat crash. And at locations that had marked crosswalks, you're much more likely to have this kind of event where the first vehicle in the curb lane stops. That's a pedestrian cross, but the pedestrian may not be able to see around that first vehicle, may not see that second car coming. And likewise, the driver of the second vehicle doesn't see the pedestrian, and so you have a collision. So this is what we found that was maybe set up by having the marked crosswalk, which encourages the first vehicle to stop in the first place. Okay, the other conclusions from our study are kind of summarized here. We've kind of gone through them, but basically we came up with some guidelines recommending where you should or shouldn't just use marked crosswalks alone. And again, two-lane roads, it's okay. Multi-lane roads with low volumes are okay. However, if you get into speeds greater than 40 miles an hour, that can create problems with motorists being able to stop for pedestrians in the crossing. So there, if you have greater speeds, you may need to consider something much more substantial, like considering whether a signal is warranted. Okay, again, raised medians reduce crash risk. And when you do have these multi-lane, higher volume situations, this is where we really need to think broader about more than just paint alone. We need to think about what are some more substantial treatments to make it safe for pedestrians across the street. Okay? Now, it's not okay to just say, well, why don't we just take out all the marked crosswalks and be done with it? Because that doesn't create the problem that pedestrians are having in the first place. We need to think about what they need to cross safely. Okay? Okay, next slide. And this actually is taken directly from the new MUTCD. Actually had it copied yesterday. And it basically goes along with our findings of our report. It says new marked crosswalks alone, without other measures designed to reduce traffic speed, shorten crossing distance, enhance driver awareness of the crossing, and or provide active warning of pedestrian presence, should not be installed across uncontrolled roadways where the speed limit exceeds 40 miles an hour, and either A, the roadway has 4 or more lanes of travel without a raised median or pedestrian refuge island and an ADT of 12,000 per day or greater, or B, the roadway has 4 or more lanes of travel with a raised median or pedestrian refuge island and an ADT of 15,000 or greater. So it's sort of a combination of number of lanes and traffic volume where you need to sort of be sensitive to where it's okay to just put paint alone, or where you need more substantial improvements, like on the higher volume multi-lane roads. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other treatments. What else could be implemented, say, in conjunction with marked crosswalks or other crossing treatments? We're going to talk about the things in this list: proper location, high visibility markings, illumination, signing, advanced stop bars, median islands, curb extensions, and signals. Okay. I mentioned earlier that it's not okay just to say, let's take out all the crosswalks and we solve the problem. And the example I like to use is if you go into a doctor's office and you have a broken arm, and the doctor says, well, you've got a broken arm, aspirin alone won't cure it, so I'm going to do nothing. That's kind of like taking out the marked crosswalks and doing nothing. What's really needed for the broken arm is to do something more substantial. We need to set the bone, put the cast on, and then maybe give you the aspirin too. In other words, it needs a combination of treatments to solve that broken arm problem. Just like a pedestrian crossing on a 5 or 6 lane road with high volumes and speeds, it's not enough to just say, we're going to just take out the crosswalk and be done with it. We really need to look at something more substantial. Okay, so first of all, let's just talk about the paint. Marking a crosswalk like this, it looks kind of like it's a few years old. It's kind of worn and cracked. A pedestrian can see it just fine, so a pedestrian would say, yes, this is a marked crosswalk. But the next slide here shows what the driver sees. The driver cannot see the marked crosswalk. It's virtually invisible to the driver in this case. So, this is something that we need to just be aware of and when we think about treatments. Okay, this slide shows 3 different options for a crosswalk application. The first one at the top is just a parallel line that we often see in most crossings. The one in the middle is what we call the continental style or high visibility, and the one on the bottom we call the ladder style, which is also a high visibility crosswalk type. And obviously the research shows that the middle and bottom crosswalk markings are much easier to see by motorists in particular, as well as pedestrians. Okay, this is a slide showing the longitudinal markings with the transverse markings, which are very visible. The pedestrian is crossing there. The drivers can see it with no problem. It's supplemented with, these are the older pedestrian warning signs. The next slide here, you can see also the high visibility crosswalks. These are actually positioned to avoid the wheel tracks, to reduce wear and tear on the paint itself. So we talked to cities like Orlando that have kind of gone with this pattern as a standard. It is more expensive to apply these crosswalks, but they last much, much longer than the parallel lines. And they position the markings to reduce wear and tear because the wheels travel between the markings. This is a photo showing a driver's view as they approach the high visibility crosswalk several hundred feet ahead, but it's very visible because of the additional paint. This is in a school zone. This slide shows sort of what a driver may see at night for pedestrians crossing in a marked crosswalk. It's difficult to see the pedestrians, even the ones in white. And remember, many pedestrians are walking at night. Maybe they've had a drink or two, wearing black clothing, and under those conditions, motorists are just not able to see and react to pedestrians in many cases, particularly when they're going more than about 25 or 30 miles an hour. So we need to think about what can we do for pedestrian crossing sites to make pedestrians more visible to motorists. Obviously, lighting is something that we would recommend to be considered at all marked pedestrian crossings. And we know from some of the literature that up to 50% of pedestrian crashes occur at night. And this is sort of a typical application where the lighting is installed above the marked crosswalk. But there is new research out nowadays that first of all documents the crash reduction from improved lighting to be about 42% at mid-block locations, and about a 54% reduction in pedestrian crashes at intersections where the lighting has been dramatically improved. This is a report we're showing here. It's called Informational Report on Lighting Design for Mid-Block Crosswalks. It was published in April of 2008 by the Federal Highway Administration, but you may want to get a hold of it if you haven't seen it. But it really gives some pretty good recommendations for how we should go about lighting our crosswalks. This slide shows sort of the old way and the new way. The figure 11 on the left shows the traditional mid-block crossing lighting layout. It does show the light pole right directly over the crosswalk, but we know now that drivers can't see pedestrians very well when the light is directly overhead. It doesn't really even cast a very good shadow. Whereas in the figure 12 on the right, it shows one light on either side of the marked crosswalk, and this makes the pedestrian much more visible to the motorist at night because one light shines so the light reflects back to the driver and the other one as well, so it gives a much better perspective at night of the pedestrian for the motorist. Okay, and this last figure on lighting shows sort of the traditional way with the lighting sort of in each quadrant. versus the upper right, which shows the new design for intersection lighting that we talked about with the lights in front of the marked crosswalk. The sketch in the bottom center would be for the wide multi-lane roads, where you also implement a light in the median, so that for the major approaches, there'd be a light on each side of the approach, covering both lanes. Okay, other kinds of treatments for pedestrian crossings. Upper left-hand corner, this is on pedestrian warning signs. The upper left shows the old way with the pedestrian symbol in the marked crosswalk. The new way on the lower left that you can implement sort of the pedestrian warning sign with the down arrow, indicating the driver that the crosswalk is here. And with the advanced pedestrian warning sign, it shows the pedestrian symbol with the word ahead. So this is sort of the new guideline in the MUTCD. Okay, in-street pedestrian crossing signs. There's really two different varieties we show you here. Some people refer to these as the knockdown signs for obvious reasons, because trucks or cars sometimes run over them and knock them down. But that's not the ideal. We want them to stand there, and so motorists can see that in this case it says state law, yield to pedestrians within crosswalk. And that would be appropriate for states that have the yield requirement in the law. The other sign for states that say motorists must stop for pedestrians in crosswalk is the other sign, the one on the upper right, that says state law, stop for pedestrians within crosswalk. So these are variations of signing. We've actually evaluated these as some of our research for Federal Highway. We have found that installing these signs, particularly on low-speed downtown two-lane roads, does result in an increase in motorist yielding to pedestrians, fairly dramatic, from less than 15 or 20% up to as high as about 60 or 65%. Of course, the downside is it's still not 100% yielding. Now, I'm not particularly one to recommend a sign like this on the multi-lane roads, 4, 5, and 6-lane roads, until those have been fully researched and evaluated. But on the low-volume, low-speed, two-lane roads, at least our research indicates that they can improve motorist yielding behavior. Okay, the next device, now this one we call the rectangular rapid flash LED beacon. It received interim approval for the MUTCD with its own separate warrants, but it's not fully adopted within the MUTCD, mainly because of the timing. So if a state wants to apply to FHWA to get this approved for implementation statewide, I'm told by someone on the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices that they can just do sort of a blanket request for approval to Federal Highway to have this device implemented, within their state. And it's a fairly routine thing. And it's not even a requirement to do the formal evaluation, although I think, more evaluation certainly would be beneficial. We call this sort of the rectangular rapid flash beacon. Studies by Dr. Ron Van Houten have shown that it can increase motorist yielding behavior from less than 20% at some locations up to more than 80% after this is installed. It does have kind of a sort of a rapid flash device you can see between the pedestrian sign and the down arrow. It has really been evaluated at several locations, primarily in Florida, and it gives the warning message, but it's much more noticeable by motorists because of the rapid flash device. It does have to be activated by pedestrians by pushing the button or by a passive detector. This is sort of a photograph in this slide showing that the beacons are really required on both sides of the travel lane. In case it's a multi-lane road, for example, and you're on the right lane behind a truck, you need to be able to see the sign, and it might be hidden if the sign is only on the right side of the road. It'll be hidden by the truck ahead. So this shows how that it should be installed on the left and to the right of the driver's view. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about, by the way, that last device has been evaluated for traffic volumes up to about 30,000 vehicles a day or a little more. But it hadn't really been fully evaluated for the really high traffic volumes. So we're not sure if that's going to be a good solution for the 5 and 6 lane roads carrying, really 50,000 vehicles a day. The next device is fairly low cost. It has been evaluated also in recent years to really try to reduce the risk of this multiple threat crash. Now you can see here, this is kind of a depiction of what we showed you earlier, where this car A, this vehicle 1, stops right at the crosswalk. And you can see the pedestrian has stepped out in front, and the pedestrian cannot see that second car, that car B, that's approaching, nor can the driver of car B see that pedestrian yet until it's too late. Okay, so one logical solution which is being used more and more is, you can see now we've moved that stop line back. The MUTCD allows you to move it 20 to 50 feet, and now, assuming car A stops at that advanced stop line, you can see the visibility distance of driver in car B has improved dramatically. Now the pedestrian can see that oncoming vehicle, and either the vehicle will have time to stop for the pedestrian, or the pedestrian may have time to take evasive action if not. So this is a fairly low-cost treatment, and you say, well, but how can you get car A to stop at the stop bar? And here's the answer. In the MUTCD, in the 2003 version, it allowed you to use these signs that would say, yield here to pedestrian with a down arrow. And that sign would go right at the advanced stop line or yield line. The signs on the right say, stop here for pedestrian with a down arrow. This was adopted in the 2009 MUTCD, again, where the local law says motorists must stop for pedestrians instead of yield to pedestrians. Okay, so here's a photograph of sort of a combination of these treatments. You have your high visibility crossing with the pedestrian warning sign, the down arrow, and then on the approach of that crossing, you have they're called yield lines, or the shark's teeth we call them. Those were in the 2003 MUTCD, and we have the accompanying sign that says yield here to pedestrians with the down arrow. So this is a message to the driver. You know, this is the place you're supposed to stop and yield for that pedestrian to cross. This looked like a little close. I think I'd probably recommend moving the shark's teeth back about another 10, 15 feet. But anyway, you get the idea. Here's an example of a stop line with the stop here for pedestrians down arrow message on the advance of the pedestrian crossing. But without this sign, you know, I'm not sure how many drivers are really going to stop or, you know, at the stop line or the yield line. So you need to have both in combination to optimize your yielding. Okay, here's a crossing actually in Las Vegas that illustrates that they've installed a stop line, looks like about 30 feet back from the crosswalk itself, which really opens up that sight distance. So, I guess in conclusion, summary on the marked crosswalk, when is it okay to mark a crosswalk without other treatments? Again, the two-lane road with less than 40 miles an hour. Also on the multi-lane roads, the traffic volume's less than about 12,000 vehicles a day if there's no median, or less than 15,000 vehicles a day if there is a median. Okay, medians are always good, but even with a median, you may need something in addition to the marked crosswalks, you know, in those situations. Okay, how can you increase the effectiveness of marked crosswalks? Okay, add a median and advanced stop line. There's textured crosswalks, and it's best to use white crosswalks when possible. Signs can supplement other marking, and illumination is always recommended where pedestrians are crossing. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about sort of along the route that includes mid-block crossings, and many of you may have major roadways where pedestrians are crossing sort of all along that route. There's not one particular crossing point. So one sort of good rule of thumb is if you have a multi-lane road, particularly a road with 4 lanes or more, if you can put in a raised median or a raised median island along there where pedestrians are crossing, the research shows that you can reduce pedestrian crossing crashes by about 46% in marked crosswalks and about almost 40% in unmarked crosswalks. So that's one of the best medicines you can use for pedestrian crossings on multi-lane roads. I know it's not as cheap as some other treatments, but it can be really effective. And this kind of shows the illustration of pedestrians crossing with a median. They stop at the curb, look to the left, and all they have to do is get to that median in one crossing period. So as long as traffic is clear to the left, they can cross to the median. However, and then wait till it's clear to cross to the other side. The problem with this flush median, some people call it a suicide lane, But a 5-lane with no raised median is it really does not function anything like a raised median. And according to our research, it's no safer by having 5 lanes than 4 lanes. It doesn't give you the safety benefit of a raised median. So if you add the raised median, this is done by Photoshop. In this case, it's got sort of a jag to the right, so pedestrians can walk to the median, walk to the right as they're looking for oncoming traffic, waiting for a gap in traffic each side of the street before they cross. That sort of gives you a sense of some possible options here. And you can see, again, that it does break the crossing into 2 steps. And there's also the option, you can see a little red arrow maybe showing you how the little jag to the right can get you to the median, and then pedestrians sort of angle to the right so they can see, they're kind of forced to look at oncoming traffic to their right before they finish the second half of the crossing. So that's also kind of a nice feature. Okay, what about pedestrian signals? Everything we've talked about so far has been at where a traffic signal does not exist, no pedestrian signals exist, but it is now easier to meet the minimum pedestrian volume warrant with the new MUTCD. And this is based partly on some of the research conducted by the Texas Transportation Institute, and plus a lot of other information that indicates that it's so difficult to meet that old warrant of 190 pedestrians per peak hour or 100 pedestrians per hour in any one of 4 hours in the day. So that this new warrant really incorporates pedestrian volume and traffic volume. It is much easier to meet that warrant under certain conditions. So do go look at the new MUTCD and see if some of your pedestrian crossings may now meet the warrant, whereas they did not before. Okay, we want to make sure that our pedestrians have a hot response, so the pedestrian pushes it. It doesn't take a long time to respond. Because if it is, pedestrians won't wait that long. They'll cross against the light, and then the light will stop traffic needlessly. And we don't want that to happen. Okay, I'll quickly go over a 2-stage crossing, and this is something that may be appropriate in a suburban area, like where you have a bus stop. You can see the overhead traffic signal. The pedestrian pushes the button and stops traffic in the direction from their left. Meanwhile, traffic from the other direction keeps going. Pedestrian crosses to the center line on the red light. Meanwhile, traffic continues on from their right or to our left. Okay, then traffic is released in the first direction while the pedestrian walks in the center island over to push the button in the median. Traffic continues now in the direction on the right and is stopped in the direction on the left due to the pushing the button. And then as soon as the pedestrian gets across, traffic resumes on the second direction. So you can see what's happened is the delay to pedestrian has been minimized, so the pedestrian just has to push 2 buttons. The delay to motorists has been reduced greatly, and it does add protection to pedestrians to get to that bus stop or across that wide street when there may not have been adequate gaps before. The requirements here are you have to have the second button in the island, and the island has to be separated so that the walk signal is not directly across the street, because otherwise the pedestrian may just try to go all the way across in one step. You do have to have the fence to force the pedestrians to walk to the right so they can push the second button and stop traffic coming from their right. Now, the next device I want to talk about is the Hawk signal. It's called the Pedestrian Hybrid Beacon. It was initially developed in Tucson for use on high-volume, high-speed roadways when a full signal was not warranted. This also is included in the 2009 MUTCD. And this is what a driver sees. They see just a blank signal when there's no pedestrian there. Pedestrians see a blank signal. Push the button, and well, they see, a red hand when the button has not been activated. And I'm not sure if this is flashing on your screen, but after the button is pushed, it goes to a flashing yellow in number 2, then a steady yellow in number 3, and there's still a hand message for the pedestrian. Number 4, now the drivers see the 2 red signals, and the pedestrian gets a walk signal with time enough for the pedestrian to get to the island, and then it goes to the flashing red, or the wig-wag for the motorist, and the pedestrian gets the flashing hand. So for motorists, it means you've got to stop, but if it's clear of pedestrians, then you can stop and proceed. and then it goes back to the blank out in the red hand. Okay, so it's really a different signal sequence than normal pedestrian signals. Okay, we're kind of on the last stage. We're going to talk a little bit about overpasses and underpasses. And as you know, in theory, grade separation, should result in no conflicts, right? Well, not exactly, because what often happens is, in reality, is pedestrians often ignore the overpass or underpass. They may be crossing at street level even when it's not safe to do so, placing themselves in greater danger. As you can see here, one pedestrian in the street, and another pedestrian just waiting to step out. So sometimes communities may put up fences to try to keep people from crossing, and pedestrians cut the fences or climb over the fences, and it just doesn't work very well. So basically, grade separation is most useful for purposes beyond just simply crossing from one side of the street to the other, such as to connect buildings in urban areas, to connect totally different land uses, to cross freeways, or cross major roads connecting to light rail stations. They're very expensive. Particularly, you can see here the long ramps that are required, to meet ADA requirements. And overpasses are very expensive in themselves. Now, undercrossings also have to be designed properly so that people will use them. Pedestrians have to see the light at the end of the tunnel, quite literally. And you can see here's one that's not designed very well. It's quite intimidating, and you can see the photograph of this pedestrian who is not too happy as she came out of the tunnel with the look there on her face. So here's an example of an elevated roadway, actually on the university campus, University of Colorado, where it's very attractive. There's, the crossing itself is inviting. It's very well lit with natural sunlight, attractive. And this gentleman is stopping to admire the artwork. So, if they're done right, undercrossings can work. You can see this one even has a skylight over it to get natural light during the daytime. Okay, so overpasses and underpasses, we're saying should be a last resort because they're so expensive. Try other options first. Because they add direction of travel. Who wants to climb a long ramp or even stairs to go on an overpass when they could cross the street level? When are they useful? Well, to connect different land uses separated by a major highway like a freeway or interstate. How can you increase their effectiveness? Well, by providing more of a direct route, providing security, but it is expensive. It's a very expensive option. In fact, here's a summary of sort of some of our different devices we've talked about with costs and their effectiveness. Signing is fairly low cost, but you're probably not going to solve a major safety problem with signing. High visibility crosswalks are a little better, a little more costly. Advanced stop bars, again, have some fairly promising outcomes based on the research we've seen so far. Illumination can benefit pedestrians, certainly where pedestrians are crossing streets at night. Raised median islands is a really good investment to improve pedestrian safety, particularly where crashes are happening or crossing 4, 5, 6-lane roadways. Traffic signals are more expensive. If they're warranted, they might be an appropriate solution in some cases. And overpasses, undercrossings are very expensive and, again, a last resort. And certainly choosing the proper location of one or more of these devices is priceless. And that's the key. Don't just pick one device and say, where can I put this device? Go and analyze each problem and figure out what is the best solution. Okay, and I'll sort of close this part of it on engineering with saying that right design invites right use. If people are doing things that look dangerous, go look at the site and see how the road's designed, or the things that can be done to the roadway environment to make it more logical, safer, and so pedestrians and motorists can operate in a safer manner. Because oftentimes, we design wide streets and wonder why people are speeding. It's because we designed them for high speeds. And then I want to add that many pedestrian crashes cannot be prevented by engineering treatments alone. Many pedestrian crashes are the result of erratic behavior by motorists or pedestrians or both, drunk drivers, drivers on cell phones, pedestrians not paying attention. So good pedestrian behavior and driver behavior need to start early. Certainly, parents and teachers teaching children, educating adults and seniors. These are examples of 6 different kinds of educational posters that were put on buses in Miami-Dade County each of the 6 posters done in sequence over a several-month period, helping to educate pedestrians in Spanish, English, and Haitian Creole on sort of the safe ways to cross the street at night, at intersections, at mid-block, getting on and off buses, things of that type. Here's an example of some educational measures from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in English and Spanish, aimed at older Hispanic pedestrians. And certainly, it's important that we provide appropriate driver education and enforcement. And this kind of shows an enforcement program in Miami-Dade County. As part of this project, we were involved with a Miami-Dade pedestrian demo study, and it was really an important ingredient in reducing pedestrian crashes along certain corridors in South Florida. So really, yeah, there's a lot we can do with engineering, but you can't stop there. You have to also think about the education and enforcement. So if we can put all these different ideas together and try to pick the best solution for the site, then we have a chance to make things safer for pedestrians. So Jeremy, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Charlie. We had a couple of minutes of the technical glitch, so we're just about at the end of our time, but we're going to go over a little bit. It's about 10 minutes of questions here. I think we were saved because we had a computer here that's running on wireless, and the network connection went down for the rest of our computers in our office. So thanks to wireless today, we kept going. And sorry for that pause earlier. Going to take a quick look at your questions and start from the top. So our first question is, do curb extensions lose effectiveness if there are bike lanes present?
Ooh, yeah, good question. Yeah, those have to be done carefully. You know, think about the road user for that given roadway. I've seen some designs that do incorporate bike lanes with curb extensions, but you certainly need to pick the curb extension design that doesn't infringe on the bike lane. So there are ways to do those designs, and we can probably find some good examples of some design plans from cities like Seattle and Portland that have shown how to do this properly. So Jeremy, is that something we can maybe include in a follow-up to this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Good question.
Okay, the next question is, do you have experience with mid-block crosswalks on major urban arterials with speeds of 40 to 50 miles per hour and 3 or more lanes of traffic in each direction, separated by a wide median? Can you give us some recommendations?
Yes. Okay, now that's a good one. In fact, that is a very similar situation to what I showed you from the hybrid pedestrian signal, the Hawk signal they're using in Tucson. I'd say that there are probably, again, 2 candidates of all the different treatments we talked about. If you're going to have a relatively safe pedestrian crossing on this multi-lane, high-speed, high-volume, those are pretty high speeds. It really kind of boils down to only 1 or 2 different options, it seems, from what I've seen in the research and the guidelines. And that would be to determine whether a full-blown traffic signal is warranted, and possibly the Hawk signal, the pedestrian beacon. And again, there are criteria or warrants in the new MUTCD that should be looked at, along with the full traffic signal warrants, to see whether the situation you're describing would meet the warrants for the pedestrian hybrid signal and or full signalization. But I would not recommend in that situation just putting paint, or not just paint with advanced warning signs, because with those speeds, those high speeds of 40 to 50 miles an hour, it really is going to take a lot to get vehicles to come to a complete stop. So we really need to be looking at full signalization, or possibly the pedestrian Hawk signal.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. So it's wintertime, and we have a good question here. Treatments, can you talk about treatments for environments prone to significant snow and ice?
Yeah, good question. I lived in Michigan 7 years, and we had our share of that. But, yeah, I mean, that creates all kinds of problems, certainly at the crossings, but, the sidewalks themselves. And in snow belt countries, Michigan where I live, Minnesota, Maine, whatever, I mean, some agencies have some fairly good policies on snow removal on sidewalks and on pedestrian crossings. Again, that's something that we ought to do a little bit of searching to find some good examples of case studies of how some agencies are handling that. But certainly snow removal, on pedestrian facilities needs to be a priority, and not just removing snow on streets and dumping the snow, on the sidewalks and on the pedestrian crossings.
Thank you, Charlie. Here's a question about the Hawks. Why are pedestrian hybrid beacons, the Hawks, better than installation of a traditional signal that is only activated when called by the pedestrian?
Okay, no, good question. Okay, there's probably about 3 different answers to that. Number one, the Hawk signal, the way that it's timed is, first of all, it's less expensive, the way it's been used so far, because there's not signalization on the side street. So it's a less expensive traffic signal. Number two, it has a signal sequence that reduces motorist delay compared to some traditional traffic signals. Number three, there's another benefit to it, and I'm trying to remember the version I showed you. A lot of the Hawk signals that have been installed more recently in Tucson are very visible, not only from the large signal heads, but also they have some supplemental signing that says crosswalk and stop for pedestrians. So that in itself makes that signal crossing more visible to motorists. In fact, some of the yielding behavior of data that we collected and also collected by the Texas Transportation Institute at these devices shows that about 95% of motorists will actually stop on a red light at a Hawk, whereas a lower percentage will stop at a red light for a standard pedestrian signal, believe it or not. So it actually has higher compliance. In fact, the TTI study found that about a 60% reduction in pedestrian crashes compared before and after these Hawks were installed, where there had previously been like a overhead warning sign. So more effective, less delay, less costly.
Okay. Now you showed us the new pedestrian crosswalk ahead sign. Now, is this crosswalk ahead sign required for unsignalized crossings, and does the placement of a crosswalk ahead sign vary depending on posted speed?
Good question. First answer, it's not a required sign at all unsignalized crossings. The METCD, I'm just looking at the wording this morning again, it does give a fair amount of discretion to the engineer to decide, when and where to use these. I think the second part of that was the placement of it. Does it depend on the speed limit? And the answer would be generally yes. There's a section of the METCD that does give recommended distances for the advanced signing based on speed limit, so yes.
Okay. Let's take one more question here. This one's interesting. How do you get state highway departments who are used to a most cars in the least time mindset to come to the local municipality's point of view that bike ped safety should be paramount?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, this is an issue that a lot of local agencies have been facing. I would start out by saying that I think that there's a real value in training and education, particularly to engineers and planners that may not be enlightened, so to speak, with understanding the need for safe pedestrian facilities. I would add that there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, not only are some of these devices in the METCD and in the AASHTO pedestrian guide, so AASHTO promotes some of these things in the Federal Highway Administration, but many of these states that are not promoting safe pedestrian crossings actually may have some of their own guidelines may require or recommend some of these pedestrian treatments. If they don't, that's something that needs to be looked at. But there's also training. In fact, I'll use this as a commercial opportunity, that there are training courses that are offered by the Pedestrian Bike Information Center for Federal Highway Administration, several courses on to try to educate people on the value of providing for pedestrians and better ways to do that. And we basically teach stuff that's right out of the AASHTO and guidelines, METCD, the latest research, best practices. One of the courses is called Designing for Pedestrian Safety. In fact, most of the slides I've used here today are taken from that course and modified. We have another course. That course is aimed at engineers, planners, as well as educators, health professionals, police. We have another course called How to Develop a Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. It's sort of a more general course that talks about strategies for how you get funding to make pedestrian improvements, how you analyze data to identify pedestrian crash and safety problems, how you select countermeasures, what are some of the details of the engineering, education, and enforcement, and sort of put it all together in a package. In fact, that course recommends that each state and local agency develop their own unique pedestrian safety action plan. So that's a 2-day course. We have a 3-day combined course, which sort of combines the best information from those two-day courses. And each of those involves 1 or 2 sort of in-field workshop where you look at a site, you come up with recommended changes in the design or the signal timing or the roadway design or policies that agency has. And then there's another course that's a 1-day course. It's called Creating Livable Communities Through Public Involvement. And that course is really the first one that we've developed that is directed more at advocates, at health professionals, and at business leaders or developers in the community. So it brings those folks together with engineers and planners to sort of talk about how the groups can work together more effectively, because many times we want the same goals even though we have different ways to go about getting them. So anyway, if you're interested in hearing more about the training, actually we have some details on our website, www.walkinginfo.org/training. Or you can just scroll down to the cover page and click on the courses. It's got a link to those, and it tells you all about the courses. If you're interested in finding out more, get in touch with Jeremy or myself, respond to the website, and we'll call and we can talk about sort of which course might be appropriate for your agency.
Okay. How about one more question?
Okay,
because
sure.
This one's interesting, and sorry we're keeping everyone over time, but there's so many great questions that everyone asked that we just never had a chance to get to. This one comes from Virginia DOT. Are there any studies on in-pavement flashing beacons?
Yes.
And what was the outcome?
Yeah, I knew I was going to get that question. Thank you, Virginia. No, there are a few studies done on that. In fact, I just had one of our researchers do a summary of the research that was done on in-pavement flashing lights. First, let me tell you that I checked this morning to see if in-pavement flashing lights were still in the new manual. It is. It's under the traffic signal section of all things. It's a beacon, but it's considered a signal. So it is still an allowable device. And there has been a limited amount of research that has looked at things like conducting surveys to pedestrians like the in-pavement flashing lights, looking at conflicts and the distance away that motorists yield to pedestrians in crosswalks with those. And without spending 2 hours discussing it, Jeremy wouldn't let me do that, but basically there's some mixed results. We have certainly seen some evidence that there's been some maintenance issues with some of them, that they're installed and they break. They don't work very well, or they have to undergo regular maintenance work. So there's the installation cost that's well, you can look at the prices, but it's not insignificant. And then there are potential maintenance issues with some devices. I'm not saying with all. The effectiveness has not been looked at in terms of pedestrian crashes. It has been looked at in terms of behaviors, and the results are very mixed. If anybody wants to see kind of a summary of the research on in-pavement flashing lights, it was done by Libby Thomas of our group. I think it's a very fair, balanced analysis of what we know about in-pavement flashing lights. We'll be glad to link that article online as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, and I guess that's all the time we do have for questions today. We ran a little over, and thank you so much for sending all the questions that you do have. There's lots of great ones unanswered, unfortunately. And if we didn't get your question today and something is you'd really like to find out some more, don't hesitate to contact us. My email address is webinars@hsrc.unc.edu, and you can call me at 919-843-4859. Before we end, I want to point you to some related resources compiled and produced by PBIC that will be posting these on the archive page of today's webinar. You can check out the engineering section of our website, www.walkinginfo.org/engineering, where we describe a wide range of engineering solutions. You can also browse a selection of frequently asked questions developed by PBIC under the subject heading Engineering. And of course, Charlie mentioned the 2- and 3-day training courses that we offer, which you can find at walkinginfo.org/training. And I want to remind you that you will be able to access a recording and transcript of today's program, as well as view a PDF copy of the slides. So hopefully your agencies will find that helpful. On this page, on the webinars page, you will also be able to register for the next Livable Communities webinar, Community Approaches to Pedestrian Safety Education, scheduled for Thursday, March 18th from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. with Dr. Jillian Hutz, who is with the WalkSafe program in Miami-Dade that Charlie mentioned earlier, and also David Parisi. And finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. And again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you to our speaker, Charlie Zagier. Thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar, and thanks for bearing with us through our technical difficulties. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.